Well, hello again. Welcome to Horror in Detail. Today we are going to share Wendigo and Cryptids encounter stories. First story. This story was shared by you/thewayidouyourmom_, so credits to him. First time I had an encounter with Wendigo. So when I was about I'd say 10 and a half, a Wendigo copied my voice. I remember having my friend who lived in the city visit me late October beginning November. She was a girl who loved horses, so I took her out to see my 3 horses, Avery, Pluto, and Caspian. I was a stupid young girl at the time and didn't think anything of the red flags, but that's besides the point. Me and my friend, well, call her Jenna, me and Jenna decided to ride the horses. Me knowing the horses chose what ones we'd ride, which were Avery and Pluto. I almost put Jenna on Caspian, but I'm glad I didn't, or it wouldn't have ended well for her. Caspian would have probably thrown her for what was about to happen. I rode Avery while Jenna was on Pluto. I had decided we're going to ride in the cow pasture since my dad bought a new cow for me. Once we got to the cow pasture, I noticed that they were avoiding the area near the swamp. I thought it was odd, but did think anything of it at the time. I showed Jenna my new cow named Captain. She thought her name was odd, and to be honest, I don't know why I named her that myself. Jenna then noticed a fox near the swamp, so we went to go check it out. As we were riding there, we stopped Jenna. She didn't tell Pluto's to stop or anything at all. She turned around and said, "He seems tense," and I didn't stop him. I didn't really think too much of it. I just told her it's probably the fox or some other animal. She didn't feel comfortable riding him since he might spook, so we yelled for my sister. My sister was in the backyard but didn't hear us, we were too far away. We tied him up on the fence near the cows. Me and Jenna both got my Avery, then ride to the fence line near the swamp where we saw the fox. Avery was tense, and all I could think of was how odd it all was since he has never spooked before or been like this. At the time I had owned him for 4 years. We once came across a bobcat on a trail and he didn't spook at all, so why was a fox any different? I got off Avery and led him to near the fence. I point out to Jenna the fox track in the mud of the other side of the fence. She got off of the horse and we sat and looked at the tracks and talked a bit. After a while I noticed Avery was extremely scared. Then about 10 seconds later the scent of death hit our noses. We looked at each other. We heard something big in the swamp. I kept my calm. Then Avery almost got out of my grip, but he was well trained, so he didn't go anywhere. I heard my own voice. That moment I froze. It was the 3 most horrifying thing to happen to me. The voice, or my voice, said, "Help me someone, I got my foot stuck, help." I immediately knew what was going on. I looked Jenna in the eyes and told her to get on Avery in a panicked voice. I could hear it getting closer to us and Avery was about to bolt on us. As I pushed Jenna on the horse, I quickly grabbed the horn of the saddle and got on. I was surprised we did that on time. Avery was a big horse and I managed to get us both on in a matter of seconds. As we got to the gate of the pasture, I got off Avery and on Pluto. We galloped to the backyard where my sister was. She was with the new puppy and asked us what happened. We told her. She promised not to tell our parents or they'd freak out. That we put the horses away, then went inside. I hugged the puppy. His name was Dakota, but little did I know he'd be the next thing to cause me to see that Wendigo again. Second story. This story was shared by you/Sleepless from Sundown, so credits to him. An encounter with a Wendigo. At 1 minute to midnight I took out the shot glass and put it beside the bottle of Jägermeister. I don't drink anymore after what happened to Pop. The one exception is the first day of September. The house is dark except for the warm glow of the 3 bulbs above the dining room table. I rub my tongue against the inside of my cheek. My mouth always goes dry. The only sound is the incessant ticking of the wall-mounted clock. At midnight the soft bell sounds, a miniature version of church bells. I fill the glass and hold it aloft for a second and swallow with a deep breath. The subtle burn winds its way into my throat and stomach. I wash the shot glass by the light of the moon shining through the kitchen window. Loretta wouldn't mind my drinking, but a used shot glass beside the sink raises questions. And I never like to talk about it. All these years later I still have nightmares. What I saw up on that mountain left a greater impression than any other event in my life. More than my children being born and my father drinking himself into an early grave. Loretta tells me I should talk about it. That it would help. She might be right. She always is. So here goes. I joined the park ranger service right out of school and it was a perfect fit. I took to academics like a fish to the desert and the outdoors always called. I passed my time in school daydreaming of the weekend and hiking or fly fishing with Pop. In the summer of '89, I was stationed in the Appalachians. Our jurisdiction encompassed trails leading all the way up the mountain. Up there the spruce thin out and clouds hang heavy even in fine weather at the base. I spent the summer clearing fallen branches from the walking trails after a couple of vicious storms over the winter. It was hack work reserved for the junior, but the truth of it was I didn't mind. The peak of the summer heat was spent and visitor numbers dropped as the weather began to turn. Persistent drizzle had kept me desk-bound for the morning and we were about to get lunch when he burst through the door. He let out a moan and collapsed to the floor. Stanley leaned down and propped him in a seated position. Water dripped from his shoulder-length hair. His limbs hung limp by his side. I handed Stanley a cup of water. Stanley used his index finger to push down his chin. When the water hit his tongue the man tensed and his eyelids flicked open. He flailed his limbs and knocked the glass from Stanley's hand. The glass shattered on the floor, but the man paid it no mind. "It is out there," he said. "What is?" The man half turned and gripped Stanley's shirt and made balls with his fists. He repeated himself, pausing after each word. "It is. Out. There." He started to sob. He released his grip on Stanley and buried his face in his hands. We lifted him onto a chair and he pressed his face against the table and bawled. I grabbed the rucksack he had dropped to the floor. On the bottom right was a name tag behind a plastic sleeve. Lenny Porter from San Diego. There was a number at the bottom. "I'll make the call," Stanley said. When Stanley returned, Lenny was sat up staring blankly at the wall with red eyes. His face was gaunt, like he hadn't eaten in a week. Stanley closed the door. "I spoke to your father." Lenny didn't acknowledge the words. He sat motionless and unblinking. Stanley shuffled across to where I was sitting and pressed his palms on the table. Lenny left San Diego 2 weeks ago with a couple of friends. They planned to spend a month hiking the trail north. The father gave me 2 names. Freddie and Sabrina. When he heard their names Lenny leaned over and picked up his backpack. He rummaged frantically until he pulled out a stack of Polaroids. He flicked through the photographs and then slapped one on the table. Stanley and I leaned over. Flanking a fitter and healthier Lenny were what must have been Freddie, tall and wearing a baseball cap, and Sabrina, shorter and wearing a bright yellow top with an almost fluorescent blue belt pulling the fabric tight around her waist. Lenny fingered the photo and tears welled in his eyes. "What happened to them?" He sobbed and shook his head. He opened his mouth to speak but no words came out. Stanley took a map down from the wall and pushed it in front of Lenny. "We are here. Where did you last see them?" Lenny blinked away tears and concentrated. He squinted at the map and pressed his index finger down and tapped it. Stanley took a pencil from his breast pocket and marked the map with a cross. "I'll notify the police. Get the truck ready to go." During training they told us about search and rescue operations. The Rangers are the first responders. It was part of the job. Twisted ankles and wandering off the trail and getting lost are not uncommon and no reason to get the police involved. But this felt different. I secured the gear in the truck and Stanley appeared, flanked by a police officer in his early 30s. "Harry is hitching a ride. His partner will take care of Lenny." We drove up the trail for about 15 minutes with the truck until it grew too narrow and treacherous. We split up the gear between us and set out on foot. Our destination was high up the mountain and far away from the trails. It was almost as if the trails deliberately avoided the area. We hacked our way through the thick forest. How had they ended up all the way out here? Stanley checked his watch constantly as we climbed. He wanted to get there before dark. I figured we would be lucky if we did. Stanley and Harry talked like old friends, asking about each other's wives and children. The park rangers are in effect an extension of law enforcement. It made sense to be friendly with the police, and living in a small mountain town made it almost inevitable. I liked that. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Stanley checked the map. "Almost there. Get your torches." "All right." Harry reached into his backpack and pulled out a flashlight. I did the same. "Do you know what's up this way?" Stanley said. I shook my head. "Somewhere up here is an old cabin. Hunters used it as a base back when you could still hunt up this way. The cross our friend Lenny put on the map is just about on top of it. Let's see if we can get there before there's no light left." We didn't make it by dark. Twilight gave to night with little warning. Soon we were relying on the light from our torches. Being on a trail in the sunshine lends a sense of security up here, even when you are alone. Now, surrounded by black and with the trail long behind us, an uneasiness grew in my stomach for the first time. Stanley paused and swept his torch. He muttered something under his breath. Harry took a few steps to the right, lowering his head and squinting. "There it is," he said. At the farthest reaches of Harry's torchlight the cabin emerged from the woods. Stanley tapped Harry on the shoulder. "My eyes aren't what they used to be." The cabin should have been a source of comfort, but it only added to my unease. The roof was half caved in and trees encroached on all sides, gnarled branches reaching out like fingers. The structure looked like it belonged more to the forest than to man. The only door hung askew on warped and rusted hinges. 2 windows had long ago lost their glass. Stanley shouldered open the door with a grunt. Leaves and branches covered the floor, blown in through the open windows and roof. We dumped the gear inside. Stanley took out a lantern and tied it to a horizontal branch a few paces from the front door. He flicked it on and the light shone bright. If there was anyone lost nearby they could not fail to see it. We split up and entered the forest, guided by our torches. Stanley instructed us to go no further than the reach of the lantern. It was our lighthouse on the horizon. The wind blew in fresh from the north. I buttoned up my jacket against the cold. The beam from the torch was strong, but aside from the narrow cone of light, the forest was a deep and full dark. Stanley and Harry called out the names of the two missing, Freddie and Sabrina. I did the same. Every few steps I stopped and listened. The forest was alive with the scurrying of animals and insects going about their business. And the constant rustling of the wind through the leaves. It was hopeless. This was needle in the haystack stuff. Freddie or Sabrina could be unconscious on the ground a few feet to my left and I would never see them. We should camp and wait for first light. Harry's voice cut through the night, louder and with urgency. I skipped towards the sound as fast as I dared. The two torchlights of Harry and Stanley played close together, the beams of light trained on the forest floor. You might not want to see this, Stanley said as I came up behind them. It was too late. By the light of the torches I saw him. Flat on his back, arms and legs bent at unnatural angles. I almost gagged when I saw his face. The left side caved in, a red, bloody mess fragmented with the white of the skull. The right side was intact, one green eye staring up, wide and unblinking. The remainder of the face had an almost serene expression. It was not the look of fear that you would expect from someone about to have half their face crushed. No skin remained below the neck, the contents of his torso picked so clean I could see his full spine. What did that? I stammered. I didn't get an answer. Stanley fished the Polaroid from his pocket and studied it under the torchlight. He handed it to Harry. It's him. It's Freddie. Harry jumped and swung his torch out into the woods. I swear I heard someone talking out there, Harry said. We've been calling out their names too. No, it wasn't that. It sounded like whispering. It's the wind through the trees. Harry didn't look convinced. He called out the name of Sabrina and listened. Only the sounds of the forest. Stanley shushed him. There's nothing we can do for the boy now. Let's get back to the cabin and radio down the news. Stanley took a few quick steps towards the cabin and motioned for us to follow. He seemed agitated. I didn't blame him. I followed on his heels. Harry lingered, searching the woods with his torch until he too fell in behind. The inside of the cabin felt like a sanctuary. Out of the wind and removed from the mangled corpse of Freddie, my mind processed the sight. I had gutted my fair share of fish, but this was different. I put my hand to my stomach and swallowed hard. I was overcome with a compulsion to repeat my unanswered question. What could have done that? Before I could, Harry gave us some more bad news. There was no response on the radio, only static. It wasn't surprising, the cabin sat in a depression between the peak we crested on our way in and the taller peak beyond. We have to go back, I said. Harry shook his head. Not in the dark and not when there's someone still out there. We don't know if that girl is dead or alive, Stanley said. I heard her. You heard a whisper is what you said. And if she was there she would have come to the light. She'll come to the lantern and we'll wait for her. Harry threw out his arms in protest. Stanley sighed. If she's dead then we'll find her in the light of morning. If she's alive and nearby enough to whisper in our ears then she'll come to us. Two rectangles of light shone through the open windows from the lantern outside, but the front room of the cabin still had dark shadowy corners. Stanley took a second lantern and tied it to an old light fixture hanging from the ceiling. The room lit up as if under sunlight, but a cold light that gave the room a bare and unwelcome feel. I busied myself clearing a space on the floor beside the black pot-belly stove at the rear of the room. Stanley and Harry stood as statues, staring up at the wall behind me. I turned. Etched in black soot onto the blank wall was some kind of monster. Long-limbed and with an elongated skull. It stared back at us through white blobs left clear of black. I took a step back and almost stumbled. What is that? I didn't need an answer. You don't live and work up in the mountains here without hearing the stories. Stories told dismissively by daylight, like you would talk about the monsters you imagined hiding in your closet as a kid. By night and around a campfire the stories take on a graver tone, and the name of the monster is only ever whispered. Wendigo. Of course I had never seen one. But if I had to imagine what one might look like, the painting in soot taking up the full height of the wall of the cabin was an exact match. I waited for one of the two men behind me to dismiss what we saw drawn on the wall. To make light of it and crack a joke. Neither did. Stanley uttered a simple instruction. No one goes outside without a weapon. Our shadows danced on the walls. The lantern hanging from the ceiling did not move. Stanley leaned and looked out the window. The lantern hanging from the tree branch swung back and forth like the pendulum of a grandfather clock. There was wind tonight, but not enough to do that. Stanley bent down and fished a rifle from the bag. My heart beat like a drum in my ears. And then something else. Whispers. What sounded like the whispers of a girl, entreating us, inviting us out into the darkness of the forest. Stanley inched open the door with the muzzle of his rifle. He stepped through the gap and watched the lantern on the tree come to a rest. He stood beside the lantern and searched the corners of the forest illuminated by the light. Nothing moved. Harry unclipped the leather strap on his belt and drew a pistol and went to the doorway. I felt naked and exposed with my hands empty. I took a step backwards, the Wendigo drawn in soot looming large behind and burning a hole in the back of my head. A shadow flashed through the trees and Stanley swung the muzzle of the rifle and shot, the crack piercing the night. He raised the rifle to his shoulder and flicked it from side to side searching for movement. The lantern bobbed up and down. With a rush a long-limbed creature dropped onto Stanley from above. He screamed and wrenched the rifle around but had it knocked from his grip. Harry fired 2 shots and the creature let out a wail. It bounded towards the door and Harry slammed it shut. He pointed the pistol to the closed door and emptied the chamber. Harry took a step back and shot me a glance. Through the whole ordeal I had not moved. I had barely breathed. Was it dead? Was Stanley okay? The window, I screamed. The long thin fingers of the creature wrapped themselves around the inside of the window frame. Then the head appeared, uncannily human-like but distorted and disfigured. The chin elongated and the teeth like razors and drenched in blood. Its eyes white and piercing. Just like the etching on the wall. Harry grabbed me by the arm and hauled me into the back room of the cabin. He slammed shut the flimsy door. The back room was windowless and the only light was a thin strip at the base from the lantern in the front room. We crouched together, our shoulders pressed against the door. We listened. The light patter of footsteps. 2 thin strips of black interrupted the strip of light at the base of the door. Something stood on the other side. Come out, it is okay. It sounded like Stanley. Had he killed it? Come out. Harry straightened and I grabbed his shoulder. Don't open the door, I whispered. They say a Wendigo can imitate those it kills. My hand brushed against Harry's back and knocked the flashlight from his jacket pocket. I fumbled in the darkness until I found it and I flicked it on. I scanned the room for something, anything we could use as a weapon. I walked away from the door and kicked at the twigs and leaves on the floor. All that was good for was kindling. Something smelled rotten. There must be a dead rat somewhere. "It's Stanley," Harry said. I pointed the torch to him. His eyes were wide and wild. He must have killed it. He smiled at me and took a step back. The door slammed open and carried with it the rotten stench. What stood in the doorway was not Stanley, but the Wendigo. Harry kneeled before it, breathing in the noxious fumes. I shone the torch onto the creature. Its gray skin pulled tight on a gaunt frame. And then something glinted. A belt buckle. Around the creature's waist was the bright blue belt Sabrina wore in the Polaroid. "Sabrina?" I said. It turned to me and paused, tilting its head to the side. I thought I saw a glimmer of recognition, a brief moment where it knew the name. But then it snarled, its mouth opening wide and dripping with saliva. It wrapped two hands around the neck of Harry and leaned in. I acted instinctively, without thinking. I jumped at the creature, swinging the only weapon I had, the torch. I brought it down on its head with all the strength and adrenaline I had. It bucked and sent me flying into the front room beyond. I threw out my hands against the fall and grabbed the lantern Stanley had hung from the ceiling. It could not bear my weight and the cord pulled out from the ceiling and I fell with a thud. I jumped up at a burst of warmth from my stomach. The lantern had smashed on impact and a white-hot filament broke free of its casing. I groaned in pain and the creature lumbered forwards. I retreated into the corner of the room and pulled my knees up to my chest. It stood over me and opened its mouth, razor-sharp teeth gleaming white. Then the smell of smoke. The creature hopped and then scrambled backwards. The leaves and twigs covering the floor ignited under the heat from the lamp filament. A small flame burst up and the creature covered its face. Fire. It didn't like fire. I crawled forwards and swept as much of the kindling as I could grab onto the flames. The fire grew and the creature screamed. As smoke filled the room it coughed and spluttered. It made one last effort to come at me and then retreated out of the room and into the forest. I went to the back room and grabbed Harry. We stumbled out of the cabin, the fire now spreading up the walls and to the roof. Stanley lay below the lantern hung from the tree, unmoving and with a chunk of flesh missing from his throat. We ran into the forest in the opposite direction the creature had gone. We first climbed up to the crest and then back down the mountain. We stumbled our way down by the light of the torch. Adrenaline coursed through our veins and we imagined that thing right behind us, stalking us in the dark. When we finally crossed a trail we followed it back down to the ranger station. A team of police and National Guard hiked up to the cabin after the sun rose. The cabin had burned to the ground, the pot-belly stove the only item that survived the blaze. The bodies of Stanley and Freddie were brought down. They said Stanley's flesh had been picked clean down to the skeleton. That was the first day of September, 1989. Sabrina was listed as a missing person and her father spent a month in the mountains searching for her. But she's gone in every sense that matters. Turned to a Wendigo by hunger for human flesh. She transformed into something unrecognizable from where it began. Around campfires people still tell stories of the Wendigo. I don't know if they truly believe they are out there. But I know, I have seen it. Sometimes there really is a monster in the closet. Third story. This story was shared by you/Maldomama88, so credits to him. Possible Wendigo encounter. Hey everyone. So my whole life I have had paranormal experiences, from seeing ghosts, objects moving, but what happened to me and the two other family members was truly like nothing I have experienced before. This all happened last year, early October. My brother and I both have an adventurous side and love anything paranormal ever since we experienced seeing ghosts in our first family home. So this particular night we wanted to go ghost hunting. Keep in mind we're not experts, but we felt confident we would experience something at least on our recorder app on our phones. We had my brother's wife accompany us along just to have more company. We live in Virginia Beach but traveled all the way to Jamestown to go to the battlegrounds and do a EVP or recording in the dunes there. Anyways, it was around 1 a.m. when we got there, and we were pumped especially because the night fit the mood. I was feeling really cocky, so I went ahead of them about 6 feet away. My brother was the only one with an actual flashlight, and the rest just had our phones, but our lights weren't on. We only had them for the paranormal apps we had installed on them that we were going to use once we got to the dunes. Anyways, it was about 10 minutes from when we got there. So far we're walking and all we see are plaques about the history of the battlefield and tall grass, above 6 feet, in certain areas of the battlefield. We saw the dunes in the distance, and while we were walking towards them I noticed movement in the tall grass. So I turned towards it and saw a tall creature peeking out of the grass in a hunched-over position. It was long and lanky. It was the shape of a human, more everything was longer, hand, fingers and face. Its color was white, more like a fluorescent white. Kinda like when it's a full moon and it glows. It was just looking at me, and the second I noticed it I heard my brother in the back say, "What the fuck is that?" referring to the creature. He shone his flashlight at it and the creature turned towards him and vanished behind the grass in a blink of an eye. I believe it was going to go towards me, not knowing my family was behind me. I am assuming he thought I was alone by the way he turned towards my brother, almost like he was confused too. As soon as it vanished I took off running back to the car, but my brother yelled at me to walk because it might chase us. So I just speed walked to the car, trying not to yell at the top of my lungs. When we entered the car we locked it and I asked to describe what they saw, and we all saw the same thing. Safe to say we're never going back there again at night. Fourth story. This story was shared by Spooks174 on Reddit, so credits to him. I was hunted by something evil in the forests of California. My name is Wilson, I am 33 years old, and I love camping. Ever since I was a young boy I loved the great outdoors. I would hunt and fish and hike, or occasionally just sit down and bask in the glory of nature. So this started when me and a few of my friends decided to go on a camping trip. I thought, absolutely, I'm not the type of person that would turn down a camping trip. So, we packed our things, filled up a small ice chest, and me and 6 of my friends, Mike, Anna, Joey, Philip, Brittany, and George, hiked out deep in the wilderness with the intention of spending a few days out there. Things did not go as planned. So we began our hike into the forest and it was rather uneventful. We parked our cars in a small town and headed out. The forest was beautiful. The sunlight shone through the leaves to where you could see the veins in great detail. Enormous vertical cliffs rose up in the distance right in front of an enormous mountain range. We passes several crystal clear rivers and vast lakes on our journey. When we finally reached our destination we dropped our bags, set up our tents, and lit a campfire. It was late in the afternoon when we had arrived. We just hung out for the rest of the day. Eventually the sun went down. There were too many stars to count in the sky and there was no moon. We ate some s'mores and drank quite a bit. One of my friends, Mike, went out away from the camp to get some firewood. We continued just fooling around by the campfire. About 20 minutes passed and Mike still hadn't come back. Anna, another friend, decided we ought to go look for him. Joey cracked a joke about he had probably just passed out from the beer. Me, Joey, and Anna walked off into the forest. We called out his name several times but he never answered. Then, we found him. It was horrible. There was blood everywhere. Mike was attached to a tree with a stick that had been jammed through his open mouth and went through his skull and into the tree trunk. His eyes still had a look of complete terror in them. His entire torso had been completely ripped open, revealing his intestines, lungs, and heart. His guts had been spilled all over the ground beneath him. Joey vomited all over and Anna started to cry. I just stood there in total shock. I just couldn't believe it. A second ago he was up and walking. And now? We ran back to the camp and told the others about Mike and how we needed to get the fuck out of here. At first they didn't believe us, but after much talking they came around. We just grabbed a few things that we could carry easily and left the rest of our things, including the tents. We began our trek back to the town. We were guided only by the light of our flashlights. Philip called 911 and told them what had happened. Unfortunately we were deep in the woods so they weren't gonna be able to get anyone out here for a while. We just continued walking forward. Then, we heard it. It was a yell that I had never heard before. It was a deep, guttural sound, almost like a bear but not quite. The yell went on and on for almost 10 seconds. And the worst part was that it sounded close. We were absolutely terrified. Anna was shaking. George was looking around anxiously in all directions. Brittany grabbed a stick off the ground and I did the same. But I knew it probably wouldn't do much. We walked forward at a pretty rapid pace. We were desperate now. We had to reach the town. There was not a single noise in the forest. No birds, animals, or bugs. Just the sound of our feet hitting the ground. But then we heard another sound. Running. Something was running towards us from the back. We started to run as well. It got louder and louder. Then I looked behind me. I couldn't manage to get a good look at it. It was running on all fours and seemed kind of hunched over. Its face seemed human-shaped but bigger. Then it leaped forward. It got Joey. Brittany stopped and ran back for him. I tried to stop her but it was too late. She didn't stand a chance. Joey cried out in agony, begging for us to come back. It butt down on his head and it was over. Then, it grabbed Brittany, it stood up on all fours and lifted her over its head. It ripped her in half as she cried for help. Me, Anna, George, and Philip ran off the path into the brush. It chased after us. I heard Philip trip behind us. Then he screamed. It ripped him to shreds. The rest of us just continued running. It was all we could do. I could hear a river just ahead of us. We burst out of the tree line and were standing right next to quite a large river. We jumped in and started to swim to the other side. The creature burst through the trees and jumped into the river. I swam faster than I've ever swam in my life. Anna was right beside me but George lagged behind. Then, it grabbed him and ripped through his skull. Blood filled the river. We just kept swimming and didn't look back. We couldn't look back. Then, Anna screamed. She was thrashing around violently in the water. I stopped swimming and kicked the creature. It was mostly beneath the water, but I could see its dark rough skin. I kicked it again and it let go of Anna. There was blood all around us. It was coming from Anna. The creature stopped in the river, and so I dragged Anna the rest of the way. I pulled her onto the riverbank. Her right leg was gone. She was screaming in pain. I took my shirt off and wrapped it around her leg. I'd slap her across the face to keep her from passing out. Then, I saw the creature swimming closer to the shore. I put Anna over my shoulder and ran into the forest. Sweat was pouring down my face, both from fear and exhaustion. As I ran, I hit many bushes and branches, so my body was pretty cut up. Anna had gone into shock. She would moan occasionally, but that was about it. I thought perhaps we had lost it since I couldn't hear it anymore. I ran out of the forest and into an open field. I rushed through the tall grass and looked everywhere. I saw the highway in the distance. Then I saw it. And this time I got a clear look. It was standing upright, but it still had a hunched over back. It was humanoid shaped and had jet black leathery skin. It was rough and cracked looking. It was highly muscular. It had long talons jutting off from its fingers. It had two bright white eyes. They were glowing with pure light. It had 3 holes above its mouth, which I assumed must be its nose. Its mouth was enormous, and I don't think it was capable of closing it. The size of the teeth varied considerably from large to small, but they were all sharp. It started to run towards me. I ran as fast as I could to the highway, but it was gaining speed. I tried to outrun it, but I couldn't with Anna on my back. But to be quite honest, I probably wouldn't have been able to outrun it anyways. It pounced on us and tore through Anna. She was dead within seconds. I curled up into a ball and braced myself. I could feel my body getting ripped to shreds. My skin getting ripped off my body. It was absolutely excruciating. Its talons sliced through my face and ripped out one of my eyes. I had never been in this much pain before in my life. Then I heard gunshots. The creature roared in pain and ran off into the forest. I heard police sirens and an officer yelled for an ambulance. They started placing pressure on my wounds. I blacked out to the sounds of yelling and sirens. I woke up a week later in a hospital. I was covered in bandages and I was hooked up to a machine. I had hoses going into my nose. The nurse told me I was lucky to be alive. She said I had an enormous number of stitches and a few surgeries. She said I would live, but I would never be able to see out of my left eye. Later on, I got a better look at myself. I was totally unrecognizable. Long and deep scars covered my face and body. I looked terrible. I lost all of my friends in that forest. There were several attempts to find the creature, but all of them failed. To my knowledge, there were no more sightings of it. I never went camping ever again after that night. 5th story. This story was shared by you/Rain2Sunshine1, so credits to him. I saw Lalachusa. Okay, I know, I am sure this story will sound crazy. This all happened about 6 months ago and I just put it in the back of my head. I wasn't planning on writing a story, or really talking about it more, but some recent events have made this all come flooding back. I am jumping ahead of myself, let me give you some background. About 6 months ago my boss asked me to drive to McAllen to go and deliver some paperwork for a company we were trying to win. I work in the IT field and we deal a lot with something called E-rate. Basically, the government gives a certain budget to schools for technical stuff and we can bid on those items to win the school. Our bid was late, so there was no way I could get it in the mail and it get to the school on time. They are super picky with these things and won't accept any paperwork after a certain time. I have seen people arrive 3 minutes late and they were still turned away. It's like the Hunger Games but with IT people, LOL. Anyway, we weren't fully done with the bid, so my boss decided to go with me so he could finish filling out the paperwork while we drove to McAllen from San Antonio, Texas. If anyone has driven to McAllen before, you will know what I am talking about. It is the most boring drive that I have ever done, especially early in the morning with a person that doesn't talk to you because they are working. We arrive at McAllen and we had to stop and get our bid professionally printed and fancy. We were going to be late, so I had to drive like a bat out of hell to get this freaking school. I don't know what I was expecting when we got there. A fanfare. Trumpets blasting from the heavens. Even a warm welcome. Good thing I got none of those. I hustled inside and the lady at the front desk greeted me and wanted to chat. She kept saying how they wouldn't accept anything late, while I drove from San Antonio. Blah 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 blah, lady, let me in, I have 3 minutes. I danced from foot to foot like I had to go to the bathroom and she finally gave me my visitor badge so I could barrel through the hallway in a desperate attempt to get this stupid packet turned in. I am sure you have all done this before, the run through the hallway, walk past the doors hustle in school. That was me, however brand new heels on freshly polished tile made me look like a drunk mad woman barreling through a school. I finally got to where I needed to go and burst into the door. A man was sitting contently at his desk. He looked at me, looked at the packet, and without a word took it. He checked the time and wrote on packet the exact time, 2:58 p.m. I puffed out a sigh and tried to make a joke about how I am glad I made it in time, yada yada yada. He gave me a sideways glance and put the packet down. He returned to whatever he was doing at his desk while I stood awkwardly in front of him. So, is that it? I asked, still half expecting some grand congrats or even a word to come out of this man. He simply nodded and I trudged my way back through the halls, a bit disappointed that I went through so much effort for such a shitty ending. The car was still running outside and my boss sat anxiously in the passenger seat. I sat back in the driver's seat, a bummed expression plastered over my face. "Did you get it in?" he asked, shifting a bit. I sadly shook my head and he froze in horror. I am not good at lying, so I burst into laughter and he let out a sigh of relief and a joking, "I hate you." From there, we went to eat something and I saw a Barnes and Noble. Of course, I had to go. We didn't drive almost 4 hours to be here for an hour then leave. I tinkered around in Barnes and Nobles and found the New Age section. I have seen spirits and ghosts since I was a child, so this section was my go-to. I love to learn about metaphysical, paranormal, mystical, whatever you want to call it, I will devour it. A few books and a Barnes and Noble membership later, and we were back in the car. The sun was beginning to set, so we figured we needed to get home. I don't remember the exact time, but it was probably around 4:30 p.m. If we were lucky, we could be back home around 8 p.m. Since I drove up, my boss agreed to drive. The drive back was just as boring, if not more so, because it was dark. The long roads seemed to go on and on. We joked a bit when we arrive at border control. My boss is Hispanic and I am white, so we made a few jokes that he wouldn't be able to cross over. Despite it being so late, there were tons of people waiting at border control. We literally waited an hour, and by the time we got through it was already 6 p.m. We continued to drive, and I began to notice that there wasn't a single car around us. How was it that border control had an hour line with all the people, yet no one was around us at all? I tried to entertain my boss by talk of adventures and stories. We had a pretty good chat until he started asking about my book selections. The conversation of spirits and creatures arose, and, as if it was planned, we saw it. About a mile up the road, these roads are flat as flat can be. You can see a pretty good distance. We could see a white, big object. You could tell it was big because it was really far off and we could see it. Plus, my boss doesn't have very good vision and he could see it from where we were. We both stopped talking and stared at this white thing, in a bit of confusion. It is hard to describe how it felt to look at this thing, but my boss described it the best. It felt as if you couldn't look away. As if you were meant to stare at it forever and you could never look away. I agree with this, but I also felt like I didn't want to look away. As if all light was getting sucked into this white object, and it seemed to emit this light as a comforting, guiding light. Despite my love of all things paranormal, I tried to rationalize this. I tried to think of what it could be, but it was as if a mist had settled in my brain and I couldn't really think clearly. I wanted to go to the light. It was there, right there, just, get closer. My boss and I entered this weird hypnotic state, and luckily the roads were so freaking straight that we wouldn't have gone off the road unless my boss yanked the wheel. The figure grew closer and we started to realize how big it was. We were driving a car that was a pretty standard size. I don't remember the type of car, but I will compare it to a Camry. This white object was about 3 or 4 feet taller than the car we were in. I stand about 5 feet 8 inches without heels, and this thing was probably, I don't know, 6 foot something. As we got closer, it was as if we could finally rationalize what we were seeing. I know when people see things they are excited or shocked by, they exaggerate and say, "Oh man, it was this big," and this makes some ridiculous arm width to show the size of it. I am not exaggerating when I say this thing was a giant white owl. Not like the owl from Harry Potter and not like a barn owl, it was just a big white owl. It was as if the darkness was being sucked into every feather. Our mouths dropped and I gave a small gasp of wonder. I have been to a few bird conservatories and there was no way this was a real owl. I would have thought I was imagining it, but my boss, who is a very clear thinker, saw it as well. "Lechuza," he muttered, and suddenly the car began to accelerate violently. "What are you doing?" I gasped, wanting to go see the owl. Every inch of me wanted to just get out of the car and go see this beautiful owl. "No. Lechuza," he said back. We were now speeding towards this owl and suddenly it opened its wings wide. Its wingspan was bigger than the car, easy. It didn't fly away, however. It just stood there with its wings open, sucking every bit of darkness in from around it, as if it were a black hole of white light. We zoomed past it and I looked back to see the owl, but it was gone. My boss had wild eyes as he drove. Eventually, he slowed down and we didn't speak a word the rest of the drive. So, why am I bringing this up now? I moved into a house back in April. I had a few ghost run-ins, but we have been living in peace with it, so I am not too worried. I have a 200-year-old oak that sits in my front yard. Last night, I heard an owl right outside my window. It sounded like it was sitting on my windowsill, but I couldn't see it from the window. I had put this whole ordeal in the back of my head, but as I stood below this giant tree in my pajamas in the middle of the night, shining a flashlight into the branches to catch a glimpse of this owl, I remembered everything. Chills danced on my arms as I decided I should go to bed. This morning, I went into the backyard to take my dogs out, and there, flying above me, was a huge white owl. I am obsessed now. I want to find it. I want to see it. I don't know if it is truly lechuza or something else, but every cell in my body is screaming for me to find it. I have been researching all morning to find more info. I have found some photos of smaller versions of this owl, but everyone says they are photoshopped. Sometimes I feel people just want to say things are photoshopped because they don't want to face the truth. They don't want to think it is possible for this to be real. I have attached some of my research below. Depending on if this owl comes back or not, I think I am going to go find it. I must know what it wants. No. I need to know what it wants. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.